Welcome to Animology, a podcast about the animal-related words and expressions we use every day and how these words and expressions shape and reflect our relationship with animals. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, and I'm your host. You can find me at ColleenPatrickGoudreau.com and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can subscribe to Animology at iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're enjoying this free podcast called Animology, I ask that you share it with others and leave ratings and reviews. Word of mouth is the best way to increase its listenership, and supporting it is the best way to keep it going. So go to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau to leave a tip in the jar, or you can just go to animologypodcast.com. And thank you so much for your support. Today's episode is Animal Characteristics in Word Histories, who they are in what we say. In the Animology episode, Old English Pigs and Old French Pork, we talk about the fact that with the increase of French words in the English vocabulary after the Norman invasion, when it comes to our words for the animals we consume, we have words rooted in Old English to indicate the living animals, and words rooted in Old French to indicate the slaughtered animal as flesh for consumption. Prior to these French-inspired or French-borrowed words, the word cow, or coo in Old English, would have been the Old English word for the living bovine. And the compound word cow flesh would have been the word for the inanimate flesh of the bovine. Swine would have been the living animal, and swine flesh would have been the inanimate flesh of the pig, and so on. What I find fascinating is that when we examine the origins, the meanings of the Old English words for these living animals, what we see in the etymologies themselves are sentient, animated beings with distinctive features, facets, and relationships. In other words, whereas the word veal in English simply means flesh of a calf, and pork in English means flesh of a pig used as food, hidden in many of the Anglo-Saxon or Old English words for the animals kept and killed for human consumption, the living animals before they were killed, are clues about the physical, behavioral, or vocal characteristics of the living animals, reflecting a tendency to name animals based on typical attributes or activities. So, the Old English word that commonly referred to those mammals belonging to the Suidae family, swine, which is how it would have been pronounced in Old English, modern swine, meant strong. As someone who has spent a lot of time with rescued pigs at farmed animal sanctuaries, I can attest to their strength in both body and in will. The word swine has been ousted by the modern word pig, and now used primarily either as an industry term by pork producers or as an insult in general. To call someone a swine is to say they are contemptible, rough, or uncivilized. Notwithstanding its current use as a pejorative, the origin of the word reveals the primary characteristic of these strong and intelligent animals. So swine means strong, whereas an adult male swine is called a boar, Old English bar. An adult female is called a sow, derived from the Old English word sugu, which simply meant female of the swine. There is evidence, however, that the Proto-Indo-European root su, S-U, may have been imitative of one of the sounds made by pigs, as reflected in the derivative Sanskrit word sukara, which means maker of the sound su, and in the Old English derivative sok, which means snout, and may also have referred to the sound pigs make while rooting with their noses. Pigs are very expressive, emotional animals who communicate via a number of vocalizations ranging from grunts and barks and oinks to squeals and roars and screams. So it would be fitting that a word to refer to them would reflect those vocal attributes. So in sow, we have a Proto-Indo-European root that referred to their vocalizations. The word pig would have been less commonly used by Anglo-Saxons, who would have simply referred to these ungulates as swine. In fact, there's little evidence of its regular use at all until the late 14th century. Pig was not used regularly until the late 14th century. The word fair, F-E-A-R-H, however, was an Old English word for a young pig and was derived from the Proto-Indo-European word perk, P-E-R-K, reflecting in its meaning a fundamental porcine behavior. The meaning of the root perk, P-E-R-K, was to dig, to furrow. And furrowing, digging, and rooting in the ground, whether for food, fun, or exploration, is indeed how pigs spend the majority of their waking hours. A pig's snout, like a cat's whiskers, provides pigs with elevated senses to explore and interact with the world around them. Researchers estimate that a pig's snout is approximately 2,000 times more sensitive to smell than the average human nose. Under natural conditions, pigs, both wild and domesticated breeds, might spend 75% of their daily activity engaged in rooting and foraging for up to 6 to 8 hours a day. However, in industrialized animal factories, from which we derive over 97% of the pork products sold for human consumption, these active, sensitive, intelligent, social animals are denied this most basic behavior, leading to extreme boredom, frustration, depression, and psychological distress. They literally go mad from the confinement and not being able to participate in their natural behaviors. So in the word fair, F-E-A-R-H, an Old English word for a young pig and derived from the Proto-European word perk, we have a reflection of a fundamental porcine behavior. Perk meant to dig or furrow. In addition to swine, a standard Old English word for these animals would have been hogga, the predecessor of our word hog, which continues to be the common term used by the pork industry to refer to the castrated males born only for death, they're bred to be killed. In other words, just as today the word hog is used predominantly as a term in the pig meat trade, the Anglo-Saxons wouldn't have used the word hog to refer to wild pigs or boar who populated the ancient forests. They would have used it only to refer to the animals they kept, who were destined for the dinner table. This is evidenced in an Old Norse word whose origins the word hog may share. Hogva meant to strike, chop, or cut. It's a sobering reference either to the final blows of the butcher's axe or to the emasculating cuts of the gelding knife. Just a quick moment to remind you that Animology is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast. Think of patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau as a tip jar. If you appreciate what you hear in this podcast, you can show your appreciation by filling up the tip jar. You can join on a monthly basis through Patreon. You can go to animologypodcast.com and you can make a one-time contribution. Thank you so much for making Animology possible. The word deer, Old English deor, has a fascinating history, as it once referred generally to a wild animal of any kind before its definition narrowed in the 15th century to describe a member of the family of ruminant quadrupeds that inhabit our shared urban and suburban and rural environs. The pre-Germanic word from which deer derives meant breath or soul, similar to the word animal that came to replace it, whose Latin root anima meant the same, breath or soul. In other words, the foundation of both these words signifies the animating principle intrinsic to all living animals, whether human or non-human. So the word deer, its roots mean soul or breath. The word animal, its roots mean soul or breath. This breath, this life, can be seen in the word fawn, a Middle English word that comes to us through the Latin word fetus, meaning a bringing forth, an offspring. Alluding also, of course, to the mother, a doe who would bear this progeny. As Rodgers and Hammerstein told us in their 1959 musical, The Sound of Music, a doe is a deer, a female deer who suckles her young, which is precisely what the Old English words for doe meant. Dion, meant to suckle, and delu meant teat. Those are Old English words for doe, dion and delu. The Proto-Indo-European word, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, is the source of all of these words, deer, dion, and delu, and it also meant to suck or to suckle. Incidentally, although not as common, mostly because I don't think we talk about them enough, we still use the word doe today to refer to the female of other mammals as well, such as antelopes, kangaroos, mice, and rabbits. The word doe denoting the female characteristic of suckling their young. Stag, from Old English staga, is what we call an adult male deer, denoting an animal in his prime. There's evidence that it comes from the Proto-Indo-European word steg, S-T-E-G-H, meaning rod or blade or sharp or stiff, a possible allusion to a full-grown stag's antlers, whose rigid pointed tips have the ability to fatally pierce a foe in battle, of course. Now, buck similarly refers to a male deer, but it's also used as a designation for the male antelopes, kangaroos, and mice and rabbits I mentioned above, whose females are known as does. So buck is a word that you can use to refer to the male antelopes, kangaroos, mice, and rabbits. But also the word buck is used to refer to caribou, gerbils, hamsters, rats, sheep, and goats. Another word for an adult male deer, now archaic, is the word hart, H-A-R-T, from Old English herot, whose Proto-Indo-European roots signify one of this animal's defining features. The Proto-Indo-European word from which we get hart is koru. Meaning of koru is horn. Fittingly, hart's Old English female counterpart, hind, derives from the Proto-Indo-European word kem, which meant hornless. So we still see a fossil of the meaning of the word hart in place names such as Hertford in the UK and later Hartford in the US, which would have meant the place where the deer, the hart, crossed the ford, the river, Hartford and Hertford. Hart faded as deer, meaning wild animal in general, narrowed to signify a member of the Cervidae family. So hart was what we called deer, deer is what we called animals in general, and then as we started narrowing deer from animals in general to a member of the Cervidae family, the deer we know today, hart faded. But you can still see it, you hear the expression hart and hind. Moving from our Cervidae to our Bovidae family, one of the first mammals to be domesticated for human use, sheep, have been bred and used for their milk, their flesh, their hair for thousands of years. The Old English words for sheep, sheap, and ram, ram, both meant strong, either referring to their physical strength or to the strong odor the males emit. Both pertain. Sheep tended to be a general word for all animals of the species Ovis aries, regardless of sex or age. But ram referred specifically to uncastrated males. The common word used to refer to the females of this ruminant family was ewe. E-W-U. And we still use that word a bit today. I think most people are familiar with it, even though we don't use it very often. The Old English word wether, W-E-T-H-E-R, referring to a castrated young male, derived from a Proto-Indo-European word that meant year, in reference to the animal's youth, as in yearling. We call an animal a yearling when he is just a year old, when he's just young. Outside of the sheep farming industry, for whom the term is familiar, wether would be a common term in the sheep farming industry, wether is still familiar to our modern ears in the word bellwether. Literally, the sheep, the wether, who wears a bell around his neck to lead other sheep to a desired destination. Figuratively, a person who acts as a lead or a guide, usually without the bell. Lamb is an Old English word meaning young sheep and has been applied to gentle or innocent persons, as in the Lamb of God, as far back as the late 900s in Old English. The Proto-Indo-European root G-H-A-I-D-O, meaning young goat. Again, I don't want to attempt to pronounce the Proto-Indo-European word. Meaning young goat forms the words to play in this 4,000-year-old language, Proto-Indo-European language. And it's also the source of the Latin hedus, meaning kid, which is, of course, what we still call a young goat and what we do when we're being playful. We kid around like a young goat. Also related is the term kid gloves, which refers to the soft leather made from the skin of young goats. That's where it comes from. The Old English word for goat denoted only the females of the genus Capra. Male goats were called bucks. So when you said goat, you were generally referring to females. To differentiate, you would say buck to refer to the males. Hence, we see the terms he-goat and she-goat appear at about the end of the 14th century, and eventually billy goat and nanny goat, which we still use today as a way to distinguish between the two sexes. So that's why we came to use billy goat and nanny goat, because goat used to refer just to the females, and then it became broader, and in order to distinguish between the two, we created these compound words. Cow is an Old English word, coo, that seems to always have referred to females of the genus Bos. Other cow words sometimes have roots that meant horned, such as the Lithuanian karv and Old Church Slavonic krava, alluding to a little-known fact that females of some bovine species do, in fact, have horns. The word steer, Old English steor, means a castrated male, but there's also evidence that the word goes back to an Indo-European pre-Germanic word stor, meaning rigid or a support, as in strong and sturdy, adjectives befitting these powerful animals whose 1,500-pound bodies stand fixed and steady, even while slightly dozing, despite American urban cow-tipping myths to the contrary. I guess they're rural myths as opposed to urban myths if they have to do with cows. So it is not true that you can push over a standing 1,500-pound steer or cow or bull, but of course that myth persists. Their strength, their steadfastness is reflected in the history of the word cow. Ox would have been a common Anglo-Saxon word to refer to the domesticated bovines bred for their milk, flesh, skin, or strength used to pull carts or plows. And interestingly, ox is one of the few words in modern English that retains an Old Anglo-Saxon plural form in oxen. You may notice that we don't say oxes, we say oxen. And it's because that's an Old Anglo-Saxon plural form. We see that same inflection in children from child and brethren from brother, an archaic word that we, I think, use for dramatic effect today, but we still say brethren. Archaic, that we don't say anymore, is iron, that used to be the plural of I, and keen, or kine, K-I-N-E, is still used in certain rural areas in England, and that is the plural of cow. But we don't have a lot of words that still have that old plural form from Anglo-Saxon, but you see it in oxen. So the word ox may have its roots in the Proto-Indo-European root ux, UKS, meaning to sprinkle, and related to a Proto-Indo-European word meaning wet or moist, referring either to their hot, perspiring bodies after being forced to work, or to the animal's seminal fluid, which is secreted from them with the aim of inseminating females for breeding. So the Proto-Indo-European words that mean to sprinkle or wet and moist could refer to maybe the progenitors of the word ox. The Old English word bula, B-U-L-A, modern English bull, denotes an uncastrated male. The word possibly deriving from a Proto-European word meaning to blow, as in bellow, or related to bullen, a verb stem combination found in some German dialects, which means to roar. Either word adequately describes the deep, expressive vocalizations made by bulls, and of course cows and steers. The word calf comes from Old English calf, meaning young cow or bull. And looking past its Germanic roots, there's evidence that that word goes back even further to the Proto-Indo-European word gel, which means to swell, in reference to a female's womb growing with the young of her offspring. The Old English word chicken is possibly derived from the same root as the Old English word cock, which is imitative of the sounds and calls of these domesticated birds. Imagine for a moment the early morning wake-up cry of a rooster, and you can hear the onomatopoeia in the Old Germanic roots kuko and kukino. The word chicken originally referred to a young bird, and then eventually to all birds of the Gallus domesticus family. But the word chick came to us much later in the 15th century, being just a shortened form of chicken. A lot of people think that the word chicken comes from the word chick. It's actually the other way around. We have chicken first, and then we shorten it to chick, and that's how we have the word to refer to a young bird. Whereas cock always referred to male birds, hen, Old English hen, always referred to their female counterparts and is derived from the Proto-Indo-European root kan, K-A-N, meaning to sing. There's even evidence that cock came from that same Proto-Indo-European root via hana, another Old English word for cock. Ranging from the soothing coos of the hens to the jubilant crows of the roosters, vocalizations are certainly one of the most defining characteristics of our feathered friends. Next to flying, nesting, preening, and dust bathing, these are all natural behaviors chickens are denied in the modern factory system. Of course, they're not able to fly, they're not able to nest, they're not able to preen, and of course, they cannot dust bathe. And that leads us to another associated word, fowl, which originally referred to any feathered vertebrate, but which gradually narrowed to refer specifically to domesticated chickens, both male and female. Old English fugl meant bird, feathered vertebrate, related to Old Germanic flug, meaning to fly. The 18th century word rooster and 17th century word roost cock appears much too late to have been used by the Anglo-Saxons, but it's based on the Old English word for roost, referring to a wooden framework of a roof on which the birds would perch. So that's how we get the word rooster. Another example of the native Anglo-Saxon speakers retaining their word for chicken rather than adopting a French version is in the word capon. A capon is the flesh of a castrated cock. The animal himself was also called a capon. The living animal himself was also called a capon. And this foodstuff was prized over chicken by wealthy aristocrats who considered it a luxury food. Caponizing male roosters, that is, removing their testicles, to allegedly increase the size of their body and improve the taste of their flesh, is a difficult and painful procedure and executed without anesthetics. Although there is an Old English word for capon in capon, it was probably dominated by the Old French word capon. Both words reflect the meaning quite explicitly in their Proto-Indo-European ancestor, skep, meaning to cut. Our final animals whose Anglo-Saxon names reflect some physical or behavioral aspect of the collective species are duck and goose. The latter, a general term for the large web-footed water birds who have long been exploited for their flesh and feathers, geese have. In this case, there's speculation that the word derived from a Proto-Indo-European word that when pronounced, and again, I probably won't be able to do it justice, produces a nasally sound when spoken aloud. And it's most likely imitative of the characteristic honking of geese. The Old English word for duck appears to have come from the verb meaning to duck or dive, referring to the action a duck makes when fishing in the water. And there we have it. The Anglo-Saxon words that convey various traits and temperaments of these domesticated animals, distinct from the Anglo-Norman inspired words for the inanimate slaughtered beef, veal, pork, mutton, venison, and poultry. By the time these words are borrowed into English, they impart no details about the once living animals, but rather signify only their dead flesh. And it is this distinction that may contribute to the cognitive dissonance posited by social psychologists. And for more on that, I invite you to listen to the etymology episode called Old English Pigs and Old French Pork, the linguistic cleaving of animals. It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff because words matter and words are so powerful. May we be aware that each word we use for animals are clues not only about how we regard them and how we treat them, but also clues about who they are to themselves and to each other and how they navigate in and interact with the world around them. May we recognize that this world is their world too. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thank you for listening to Animology, changing the way we talk and think about other animals.